Just going through a few of these proposed changes, removing the annual fee disclosure arrangements, you say it could save significant amounts for companies. How much could that be? It seems to be a pretty small task and one that does provide that valuable information of how much people are paying.
We're not removing fee disclosure going forward, but we were removing the requirement to provide a history of fee disclosure, and some of the companies indicated to us, for example, that it would be a significant cost to go back and recreate some of this history in the sort of detail that was being prescribed. In broad terms, this package will save industry as a whole about 90 million in implementation costs and over 190 million or so in ongoing costs. So for us, this is about preserving the spirit of the reforms under future financial advice while reducing the cost of complying with them, so that we make the cost of advice as accessible and affordable as possible.
You also want to allow for scaled advice again. This is essentially specific one-off advice, if you like, tailored advice. Now, this seems to ignore some of the evidence we heard from a Senate committee that this very kind of advice led to those large losses seen in the storm financial crisis.
What we're doing there is removing some ambiguity that was in the legislation which provided for scaled advice. The explanatory memorandum spoke about this, so what we're doing is making it clear that it is possible to have scaled advice. And what we're saying there is we believe, subject to all the other reforms we're making, that particular tweak or change won't lead to a sudden proliferation of the sort of issues that you're referring to.
A lot of people, though, do make large financial commitments when they're going in to get this advice. It can affect the rest of their lives. Isn't it better for them to get a complete picture, if you like, a holistic view, rather than seeking this tailored advice they might have seen on an ad or heard from a friend, perhaps?
I don't have a financial services licence, but my advice to people is that it is best at the start, when you're contemplating your finances as a family or as an individual, if you're, say, starting your working life, sit down and sketch out a bit of a plan about your aspirations, and then sit down with the relevant advisors to work out how you can realise those aspirations. And then a lot of the other decisions you make along the way sort of fall into place because you've got the overall framework clear of your plan about what you're wanting to do and the milestones by which you want to achieve certain outcomes.
You also want to remove a general provision where advisors always need to act in the best interests of their clients. That seems counterintuitive, really, to improving conditions for consumers.
What we've done is we have a fair bit of specific material in there about what constitutes advisors doing their best to provide advice to their clients. The problem with the catch-all was it was a bit like providing such a blanket duty that it would create uncertainty in the minds of advisors and possibly even some risk aversion in providing advice, and make them perhaps even overly conservative at a time when they've got to be able to provide robust advice which appropriately balances the risks and returns of different ways of doing things. And can I add, what this package is also about is saying to our fellow Australians that it's the onus on us as consumers to also understand that we are in charge of our financial destiny, and we take the final responsibility for our decisions. So it's not just a matter of blindly following the advice of anybody. It is about us also balancing that advice when we receive it.
You spoke about those conditions making some financial advisors risk-averse, overly conservative, but having just been through a global financial crisis, is that always a bad thing with people's life savings?
Look, in relation to matters like global financial crisis, you don't want to get to a situation where you're effectively saying to people that they should provide advice on the basis that there could be a GFC around the corner. Now, these are events which happen from time to time. They can have a low probability, but the point is that you need advisors who have historical perspective, go back a number of years, don't get caught up in the ebbs and tides of things. Sometimes before the GFC, people became over-optimistic. Since the GFC, some people have become over-pessimistic. It's important to have a historical balance and not be overly just influenced by the most recent turn of events.
Another area the government's looking to make changes in is electricity. We heard this week, we know the plans, of course, for getting rid of the carbon tax, but we heard this week as well the Prime Minister take aim at the renewable energy target. He said about that it was causing pretty significant price pressure in the system. What sort of price pressure are we talking about, and what evidence is that based on?
What the Prime Minister and the Industry Minister were talking about was the fact that the way the RET operates, it effectively does involve increased costs of electricity onto consumers, which adds further to the cost impost that they have through the carbon tax, and also importantly because of the wave of investment in modernising plant and equipment and upgrading plant and equipment in electricity that we've had in recent years, which has led to very severe impacts on demand for electricity. And what the Prime Minister and the Industry Minister were saying, that in the context of looking at competitiveness, we've got to make sure that the signals we're sending through the energy sector are supportive of our competitiveness. Now, this is all separate to the debate around how we tackle climate change. We have a direct action agenda to tackle climate change, so this is in no way an attempt to try and derogate from that agenda.
Right, it is related though, renewable energy. Most people would agree it's going to bring down emissions, and the Australian Energy Market Commission says it makes up about 1% of the average household's electricity bill. That doesn't seem to be a major price pressure.
The advice I've received is that, and the energy companies can verify this, that it has had a significant cost impact, as had, as I said before, the investment in upgraded plant and equipment. And in that regard, in recent years, some state governments have indicated they want to revise those investment plans because they feel that they may have been overly ambitious. And the industry ministers made the same point. We need to be able to look at the cost of providing electricity, and as I said before, that is a separate matter to what we are doing on climate change through policies such as direct action.
Well, looking at the provision of electricity, Tony Abbott's also said that we need to be an affordable energy superpower. Now, one of the things that springs to mind straight away there is the recent boom in natural gas that Australia has and is beginning to ramp up production of. It's also, though, ramping up exporting, and that is going to increase gas prices. So wouldn't a pretty simple solution to be the affordable energy superpower be to quarantine some of that for domestic use? That would be a pretty simple way, wouldn't it, to drive down electricity prices?
That would be a pretty simple way to also reduce the incentives to find increases sources of gas and other important fuels. The best way to maximise availability is to encourage the price mechanism to bring forward the necessary investment in finding additional capacity. The resources super cycle we've just been through with very high mining investment is now bringing forward a big increase in export volumes, and that export supply, that analogy, if you like, can also play out in the gas sector in terms of the availability of gas for both domestic and export.
You think the balance is right then, because gas prices are set to increase because of our
what happens, Tom, is that high prices bring forward supply, and that supply then reduces prices.
So you think the balance is right?
What I'm saying is the balance will be right if we let supply and demand operate in the normal way.
Okay, and also you have said today that you don't believe the renewable energy target is linked to reducing carbon emissions. We've heard, though, the PM say this week he'll consult closely on that with the Business Advisory Council, chaired, of course, by Maurice Newman. He said that the climate change science is somewhat in tatters. Is there a readying of the ground here to reduce that renewable energy target? Would you like to see it kept at 20% or not?
We will proceed with our climate change initiatives, including, importantly, the suite of initiatives called direct action. That was one of our election commitments, and we're in the business of meeting all our election commitments. So
you don't think that that figure of 20% necessarily needs to stay?
Look, as I said before, we're in the business of meeting our election commitments, and while there will be a review of the renewable energy target, it will of course also take into account the broader implications that we've discussed.
All right, I'll just touch finally, if I can, on MyEFO. We saw some pretty, I suppose you'd say, scary figures in there. Everything's on the table we're hearing. We know there's quite a few election promises that won't be included on that, but the paid parental leave might be scaled back to get through the Senate. Is that something that you'd like to see happen, back to a cap of perhaps $100,000 per annum in terms of salaries paid out?
What I'd like to see happen, Tom, is for all our election commitments to go through the Senate, including the carbon tax repeal, mining tax repeal, and also the paid parental leave plan. So I'm not going to speculate on what may or may not happen in the Senate, except that when a government has a mandate to do things, and Tony Abbott is very closely identified with the paid parental leave plan, I think the Parliament should do him the courtesy of respecting that mandate.
But when it comes to the carbon tax, for example, obviously the Prime Minister has been very firm, saying he wants to repeal it, repeal all related measures he said he would, including as well the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. So him saying that, well, we might need to just get this through the Senate, perhaps do a deal with the Greens, an indication it might be somewhat scaled back.
Look, I'm not going to speculate on what deals may or may not be done. All I'm saying is that the first best approach is for our promises to be respected and for the Senate to pass the legislation we've spoken about.
Just finally, all options on the table we heard, as I said. We know some areas are quarantined already. Are there any areas you would be particularly fearful of major cuts in when it does come to that May budget?
We've got the Commission of Audit doing a pretty thorough review of all areas of government spending, and subject to our election commitments, we'll look at what the Commission of Audit is saying, and I think the overriding priority in doing that will be what is the appropriate size of government for Australia at this stage of our development, and how most efficiently do we deliver government services, and what role the private sector, the non-profit sector and others can play in the delivery of important government services, where that can be efficient and cost effective in the public interest.
All right, well, I'm sure there'll be some pretty robust discussions behind closed doors, but Arthur Sinodinos, thanks very much for your time on Sky News today.
Thanks a lot, Tom.